Hello, everyone around the world joining us for this webinar on anticipatory innovation, where the future fits. My name is Josh Polchar, and I'm co-hosting this session with my colleague Julia Stout. Over to you, Julia.
Hello, and also a very warm welcome from my side. I'm excited to be co-moderating the following 1.5 hours and be joined by the head of the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation and a great panel that we will hear from a bit later on. Over to you, Josh.
Thank you. So while we're just getting started, if you haven't done so already, we invite you to use the chat to introduce yourself, tell us where you're calling in from and what organization you're with. We want to also mention that we're very grateful to the support we're getting from the European Commission's Horizon 2020 program, and we're hosting this webinar as part of that program. So do feel free to tweet along. We have our mentions, which are at OPSI Gov, at OECD Gov, and at EU_H2020. We'll put those in the chat for you to use as well. Let's get started right away. We're really pleased to have with us the head of the OECD Observatory of Public Sector Innovation with us, Marco Daglio. Please, over to you, Marco.
Thanks, Josh, and thank you to everyone present today for joining the seminar. My name is Marco Daglio. I'm heading the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation that has prepared the seminar as part of the H2020 program sponsored by the OECD, by the EC Commission. So the purpose of today's webinar is to explore the tangible ways in which public sector organizations detect, understand, and act upon future changes in their present-day work. So terms like future-proof or future fit are used so often that they can lose their meaning. They only have meaning if organizations do work. They act in the present to better prepare for the future. This is a matter of better knowledge and analysis, of course, but it's more profound than that. Because the future matters when we consider the legitimacy of policy decision in a democracy. The future matters in how we face the challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss, but also the future matters for making the fast-moving digital transformation inclusive and beneficial for our well-being. This is really central to OECD work and analysis, in particular on how strategic foresight makes a key contribution to strengthening and growing democracy, promoting public trust, tackling climate change, and preparing governments to better serve societies where people live longer, healthier lives. The need of the future are the work of the present. In this webinar, our panelists will discuss how they fit the future into the present. This is a very prominent challenge. And one of the key themes will be really about experimentation. It's impossible to know the future in advance. We all know that. Let's still have all the right answers, but considering multiple alternative futures help us to imagine what might happen and make more prepared decisions today. So the learning and evidence gathering that experimentation allows are at the heart of what is public sector innovation today. And they're also at the heart of effective, democratic, and sustainable public policy. That's what we mean when we talk about anticipatory innovation governance. So I wish you all a great conversation and leave you the floor to Josh, who will introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marco. We really appreciate having you here to kick us off. And I'm going to say a few more words about our work here in the observatory before we hand over to our three very distinguished and experienced panelists to talk about this topic in greater detail. So here we go. This is our team working on anticipatory innovation within the OECD Observatory of Public Sector Innovation. It's one of the 4 different facets of public sector innovation that we consider alongside mission-oriented innovation, enhancement-oriented innovation, and adaptive innovation. So Anticipatory innovation within the government and governance context is really about saying governments are considering the future all the time, but they're not necessarily making the most of everything they could or maybe should know about the future in order to better prepare for and shape the future. And that's what we call the impact gap. There's no shortage of really great strategic foresight and anticipation work out there. A lot of it is being generated by governments themselves, as well as organizations like the OECD. What we're really about in our team in Anticipatory Innovation is looking at the ways in which strategic foresight and other anticipatory work can be taken forward and really make an impact on the policy actions that governments take. So we've been developing new approaches of prototyping, which take strategic foresight work forward and really embed it into the work of national governments and develop innovative and value-changing prototypes and experiments, which help us to bridge that infamous impact gap. And we have collaborations with governments and other organizations all over the world. Here are some of our flagship projects. We're currently working with Finland, Latvia, Slovenia, Ireland, and Portugal in various different capacities. You can find out more about the logic behind our work in our brief on anticipatory innovation governance. And we also have a report on building foresight systems with a particular focus on the government of Ireland, which was published recently. I'm going to come back to this at the end, but I'll mention it right away at the beginning. We also have a flagship conference coming up on the 18th to 19th of October called Government Beyond Recovery, which is going to be a virtual conference. And it's really the highlight of the OPSI year. So we'll be saying a bit more about that at the end. But for now, let's get started with our panel for today. So as we mentioned, we have three fantastic panelists. I get to introduce one of them and Julia will introduce the other two. We're delighted to have with us Cheryl Chung, who is the Program Director of Executive Education in Singapore Futures at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. She oversees the school's training and consulting business for the Singapore and open enrollment markets. She's also building the futures and strategic foresight capacity at the school with the Singapore Futures program. Her interests focus on the intersection of technology, economic and regulatory policy on capability development in futures thinking for policymakers. Julia, do you want to introduce our other two panelists?
Yes, with pleasure. We've done this to be very varied on the gender level, that I'm introducing the male panelist and you've introduced the female one. So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Laurent Bontou, who is joining us from the EU. He has got breadth of experience working in foresight in various EU functions and is currently a senior foresight expert in the Joint Research Center's Competence Center for Foresight. His work involves bringing future-oriented systems thinking into EU policymaking. And to do that, he uses inclusive and participative techniques with key stakeholders. There's three examples that I'm sure we will hear a bit more about coming in the coming discussions about his foresight work. He's created a shared vision for the EU Customs Union, developing future sustainable transition pathways for jobs and economic development in the EU. He's running a qualitative foresight exercise on the sustainable development goals in the EU that will be used for the Commission reflection paper towards a sustainable Europe by 2030. Very welcome, Laurent, and we're curious to hear more from you. Then we have André Leuze-Pietri, I hope that was pronounced as you told me to, who brings a breadth of experience from both the private sector and the public sector to feed into today's discussion. He is currently the director of JEDI, and again, I hope that's pronounced correctly, the Joint European Disruptive Initiative that was founded to accelerate Europe's leadership in disruptive innovations. And he has launched the first DARPA type Grand Challenge for Europe in 2020. He is a graduate of HEC Paris and Harvard Kennedy School, and now is turning over the page by being a lecturer at Sciences Po and also as a regular columnist in several international media. He attended the Sub-Aero Aerospace Engineering School, was named a young global leader by the World Economic Forum, is a private pilot and colonel with the French Air Force People's Reserve, to only name a few of his accomplishments. He has also been an advisor to the French government, so really brings many years of experience in leading positions from both public and private sector roles. Welcome, we're very glad to have you. And now I will be giving a bit of an introduction to the following session so that you know what the outline of today's webinar will be. We're going to turn it over to our distinguished panel in just a moment to hear a few remarks from them based on the theme of today's discussion and some questions we shared with them in advance. And we will then, Josh and I will then lead the discussion going forward. Throughout this, we will be referring to the Q&A feature that's part of this Zoom setup to hear your thoughts and questions from the audience. I've glanced into the chat. We really have an audience that's very international. I've seen somebody coming from Budapest, Portugal, Belgium, Chile, Estonia, the Netherlands, Sweden, Colombia, and so forth. Some of you shared cities, some countries. So I'm very excited to hear from you. And we have our colleague Chiara, who will help us with the moderation of the chat and feed some of your questions into the discussion. Hello and welcome, Chiara. So please don't hesitate to share questions even while the panelists will be speaking. And I will now open the time for the panel and hand it over to you, Cheryl, to hear your thoughts. What were your main thoughts when we shared the questions with you?
Great, thanks so much, Julia. And thank you so much for this wonderful invitation. So it's such a delight to be able to meet everybody virtually, even though we can't be together face to face. So my name is Cheryl Chung. I'm the Program Director of Executive Education Singapore Futures at the Lee Kuan Yew School. And our work mainly focuses on the intersection of futures, public policy in Asia. So that's the kind of the perspective that I'm coming from. So we got all the panelists, we got this wonderful list of questions, which I think will take us a long time to explore in its fullness, but maybe allow me a couple of minutes just to share some top line thoughts. So, we will ask questions about like, what kind of policy experiments would you like to try? What are the lessons that you've been learning and so on. And I think the first lesson I will talk about is organizational habits when talking about public policy and futures practice within a public policy context. Organizational habits matter a lot, right? So I think there's one kind of conversation that we're very tempted to have, which is around, what's the most beautiful, compelling, attractive, vision of the future, that we all should work towards. But actually, how do we get there? I think a lot of that comes down to practice, right, and organizational habits. And I think particularly in large bureaucratic institutions, governments being one type of large bureaucratic institution, but we don't have the monopoly on that. There are things which kind of stand in the way, right? And these could be, policies and precedents, the kinds of rules, and routines that are in our organizations that we're used to, that we kind of fall into these habits. The things that have been done before that we don't want to change because that's how we've always done it. And culture and capabilities, right? The kind of, I would say, social environment that maybe we find ourselves in that maybe make us more risk adverse, or that, the capacity within the organization doesn't quite exist. And I think unless we start to investigate some of these organizational habits, actually thinking about the future and innovation becomes quite challenging, right? So I think that just having that understanding that it's not just about the vision, right? But it's also really this way that we're doing things. And I think futures is really about this question, what if we were wrong? It's not so much about, oh, is your organization thinking 20 years ahead? Because every organization is thinking 20 years ahead in some shape or form, whether that's implicit or explicit, and whether that's articulated to everyone and understood transparently. And so all of us even, come into an organization kind of, with a narrative that already exists. But what if this narrative were wrong, right? And I think it's a difficult question, again, for large bureaucratic organizations to even entertain, right? But COVID seems to have convinced us that disruptions exist. And we can be pretty wrong in a very dramatic, kind of impactful way. So I think now talking about this work, in 2021, the focus now, I think, is on preparedness, rather than trying to convince people that actually we might be wrong. And this is really where I feel like futures work and that long horizon longer horizon in terms of being able to solve problems and bigger problems if you had a longer runway to solve them. So for example, if you were thinking about the education system in your country, and everybody has their own pet peeves about the education system in their country, and one of those pet peeves, and you thought to yourself, oh, if I have 6 months to solve it, what would I do? It's likely that your solution would be quite constrained, right? But if you said, okay, if I had a 10-year, or if I could solve certain set of problems in a generation, what are the policy options that are available to me? I think that changes the game completely. And I think that is ultimately the goal of futures work, and then tying it into that innovation process. And that's where, experimentation plays a huge role. Because at the end of the day, futures is about taking in uncertainty. When the government wants to make decisions in this perfectly certain, perfectly stable information environment, which does not exist, right? And that definitely does not exist in the future. But so how can we continue to not be paralyzed completely, by all these, by uncertainty and by trends and by just, disruptions and us potentially being wrong, right? That's where the innovation and experimentation comes in. So maybe if I can leave with a closing thought before I hand off to my co-panelists, is maybe this thought of the myth of the best practice, right? And it goes back to my earlier point about organizational habits mattering, and there's a lot of conversation that we often have in our organization about, especially in public sector, but what was the precedent? Or what does the policy say? And then can we apply that again and again, right? But I think when looking at the future, that's a myth, right? So there's the myth of this best practice, the way that we've always been doing things, and that, if we do them again, they will work. And the reality is that maybe nobody knows, right? And then our challenge then becomes, how do you design experiments to learn together? Both not just the public sector, but also the public sector, perhaps with academia, perhaps with the private sector, and undergo together some sort of deliberative learning process, to test, to observe, to reflect, to test again, and I think that's I hope, some of the things that we can discuss later on during this session. So back to you, Julia and Josh.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. And that was a wonderful segue into what we really want to get our teeth into in this session, which is indeed this fact that we can't necessarily rely on the lessons of the past to know what's going to work in the future. So all we can do is learn together, experiment, try things out, and have the humility to recognize when we might have got things wrong or where we might have to change course. And I did put down how do you get people to get comfortable with the fact that they might be wrong, which is inherently an uncomfortable prospect. We're now going to hand over to our next panelist, who is Dr. Laurent Bontou. Laurent, we're really keen to hear from you. What were your thoughts when you were engaging with the subject of today's webinar? And we're curious to get some insights into the tangible foresight work that you're doing at the EU level. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Josh. Thank you very much for having invited me here today. I must say that I recognize a lot of what Cheryl was just saying. I guess human beings are the same type of human beings around the world, in spite of cultural backgrounds that might be different, or the food they eat that might be different. But I recognize a number of keywords, like uncertainty, even what you said just now, Josh, humility. I think I want to, first of all, highlight the specific circumstances that I have experienced at the European Commission. I think one of the dominant factors that we have to deal with is the very strong pressure from the policy and the political side in particular on the very short-term future, on now, we need this. I'm just laughing because yesterday we were in a meeting where our cabinet is asking us now on stuff on Afghanistan, it's like, and for the foresight team, I'm saying, don't they get it? I mean, our point is to do horizon scanning and to start to discuss things and to reflect on what things could happen way before it happens. It's not our job to be as a sort of crisis response team. So there is this, misunderstanding from the policy side on how best to use foresight. And that's combined with also a culture of efficiency in the Commission, which is very often also combined to a culture of the quantitative, which create barriers to us, who try to be thinking ahead of the curve and who try to develop, participatory approaches, considering a broader range of factors, including people's values, including, how people's behavior can change, including a lot of parameters which do not fit very easily in quantitative models. And so we face a lot of, a big lack of foresight literacy in the organization in which we work. And so that's why we're, and actually later this week, I'm going to spend 2 days, training colleagues across the Commission in terms of what is foresight and how best to use it. And so we're glad to see that every time we offer a course, people subscribe to it and it's actually full quite quickly. So there is hope for the long term, and people are very interested, especially in times like now where, as Cheryl was saying, COVID has shown that unexpected can happen. And so we have to be ready for this. And so we really wanted to develop this way for people to become, I was not going to say familiar, but at least more comfortable with uncertainty. Uncertainty doesn't necessarily need or mean something bad. Uncertainty just means you don't know. And what comes after the uncertainty can be very positive, just in the same way that it can be very negative. And so foresight is there to help people actually steer the ship towards the positive and avoid the negative. And, I was also happy to hear Cheryl talk about the myth of the best practice, because this is something we're fighting all the time. And because of the diversity of contexts within which we have to operate, different policy domains, different very specific policy requests, while foresight and the foresight toolbox is full of very standard methods, very standard processes, actually we have to experiment all the time. Every request we have, every project we have to start is new. We have to combine things in a different way. We have to tweak, the standard methods according to the circumstances. We have to adapt to specific people. And so actually experimentation is daily life. It's like there's no, I don't see, or I cannot remember any project that we've done which has not required some form of experimentation. And, after a stint in one of the cabinets of the Commission, actually, one of my dreams, if I can think really out of the box and I would like to try something wild, would be to actually organize a foresight participatory session in the College of the European Commission. I'm one of the co-developers of a tool called the Scenario Exploration System, for example. So I would really love, to have 3 hours with the college to explore a couple of scenarios with these people, applied to one of the questions that they're interested in today, and to see how that could actually contaminate their thinking with foresight seeds. So that's a bit my wild dream, and I'm going to close it here to leave the time to the other panelists to